Welcome, everybody. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm Chief Content Officer at RealClearPolitics. And today we're going to talk a bit about U.S. voters' attitudes towards the military, and in particular about a recent poll on the subject conducted by RealClear Opinion Research. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have some opening comments from some of my colleagues, followed by a short discussion, and then we're going to answer some of your questions. We're going to keep today's program to about a half-hour length. We'd like to answer as many of your questions as we can. And you can see the full results of the poll we'll be discussing on the RealClearPolitics website. It's up now. You just go to realclearpolitics.com, open the Opinion Research tab at the top of the homepage. You'll see the poll material, including the top line, the methodology we used, and the crosstabs, as well as Carl Cannon's article on the poll. So joining us today are Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for RealClearPolitics, and John Della Volpe, who is Director of Polling at RealClear Opinion Research. So John, let's start with you. What are some of the poll highlights, and tell us a little bit about the methodology involved?
Sure. Thanks, Andy. So the survey was conducted with more than 2,000 registered voters across the country, 2,086 to be exact. We conducted the poll from September 16th to September 20th. It was conducted online, and it is representative of the overall American electorate of registered voters. As you said, the crosstabs and the top line and some more details on methodology are available online. When I think about this latest in our multi-year series of surveys at RealClear Opinion Research, I think so much about the conversation that seems to be consuming Washington, D.C. and the rest of us about everything being political, everything being partisan. And for me, one of the bigger takeaways from this is that we actually do find some alignment between Democrats and Republicans on issues related to the military and issues related to America's defense. What I want to do now is just share a handful of slides, talk about the top lines. Carl will have an opportunity to kind of weigh in, and then we'll open up for discussion. But number one, the first slide I want to show is about views related to the role and mission of America's military. So if we could share that slide, we can see here that we asked American voters whether or not they support or oppose following roles and missions of the U.S. military. We can see that overall, 3 out of 5 Americans support each of the most significant current roles of the military, from defending Taiwan in the event of an attack by China, 61%, that's on the low end of the scale, but there's no gap, no daylight at all between Democrats and Republicans on that issue. We see that 62% support rebuilding political and physical infrastructure, nation building. Democrats a little bit more supportive of that than Republicans, but again, no gap in defending South Korea in the event of attack against North Korea. 2/3 of Democrats, 2/3 of Republicans, and nearly as many independents support that potential mission. Curbing aggression by adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, again, overwhelming support. 3 out of 4, responding to natural disasters. Number 1, protecting human rights like the rights of women, children, religious or ethnic priorities. 82% of Americans, more than 80% of Democrats and 80% of Republicans support that mission. One of the takeaways from this particular side, I think, is, again, overall support for the U.S. military, more support for missions that would be classified as soft power missions compared to the more traditional hard power missions. I think that's noteworthy. The second place where we do see, I think, alignment between Democrats and Republicans is on trust. Specifically, if we should show the second slide here, John, specifically trust in our U.S. troops and military generals to do the right thing all or most of the time. 74% of voters trust our troops, our sailors, our airmen, Marines, and soldiers. Republicans slightly more than Democrats, and we can see that a majority also trust military, our U.S. military generals, the flagged officers, to do the right thing all or most of the time. Again, where we saw a gap for between Republicans and Democrats for trusting troops, we see a similar gap on the other side for military generals. And then we can see the kind of the divide set in when we begin to talk about the civilian elements of the military, the Pentagon. We can see a 20-point gap between Democrats and Republicans. And then the divides, it kind of expand from there as one might perhaps expect. Only 1/3 trust Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, all or most of the time to do the right thing. He has majority support from Democrats, but only 1/5 of Republicans trust him, 1/4 of independents. Similar numbers, almost exact, for U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Moving on, we begin to see one other element that where there is alignment between Democrats and Republicans, and that is on actually opposition to the draft. Only 37% of Democrats, 36% of Republicans support reinstatement of the military draft. But there are some differences. There are some differences as well. And on the third slide, we'll share some data regarding Afghanistan. And overall, we know that a majority of Americans support withdrawing the 2,500 troops from Afghanistan. The blue bar in this chart indicates the level of support. The red bar indicates the level of opposition. You can see here, of the dozen plus subgroups of the American electorate, every single subgroup, whether it's gender, generation, race and ethnicity, education, race by education, or kind of geography, red state, blue state, swing state, other than Republicans, support America's withdrawal of the 2,500 troops from Afghanistan. So majority support, but Republicans at this point overwhelmingly kind of oppose it. It's worth noting, Carl and I had a conversation earlier, a couple of years ago, when President Trump was our commander-in-chief, there was majority support for reducing withdrawing troops, Republicans more likely than Democrats. So again, we can see the kind of the partisan angle currently regarding Afghanistan policy. Then the next slide I want to share is related to our adversaries. And while we have general kind of alignment that China is our most formidable adversary, we can see that is largely driven by overwhelming concern about China from Republicans, almost 2-1 compared to Democrats. And we can also see that when we look deeper into the data that Carl mentions, there's a specific generational divide as well, that Republicans, specifically older Republicans, are much more concerned about China, whereas younger Americans, Gen Z, millennials, and even some Gen Xers see the concern about China, but they're balancing those concerns with a heightened concern about terrorist groups like ISIS, ISIS-K, Al-Qaeda, as well as the Taliban also being a chief adversary. So there's concern among younger Americans that there's China, but also kind of terrorist groups, whereas for older Americans and Republicans, they're much more focused. They're much more focused on China. The last thing I think I'd like to mention is the state of threats. Again, we also see some divides here as well. When we ask American voters whether they are more concerned about foreign threats or domestic threats in the country, a majority of all Americans indicate they're most concerned about domestic threats. 67% of Democrats feel that way, 62% of independents feel that way, but less than a majority of Republicans feel that way. More Republicans feel that our main concern should be foreign threats, whereas Democrats and independents say the greatest threats facing the health and security of our nation come domestically. So I think with that, turn it to Carl. I've got some other numbers that we can talk about as well, but I just wanted to provide an overview of what unites us, and then also where some of the divisions are regarding military and defense policy. Thank you.
That's great. So, Carl, yeah, give us your thoughts.
Well, I want to go back to this partisan difference on national security because I find that disturbing. It's not new. It didn't start with Joe Biden. It didn't even start with Donald Trump. There was a Gallup poll done the kind of divide we're seeing now started, as best I can tell, during George Bush's presidency, George W. Bush. So in 2006, I'm going to read you, this is CBS News poll, February. Looking back, do you think the United States did the right thing in taking military action in Iraq, or should the United States have stayed out? That's the question. Right thing, Democrats, 19%. Stayed out, 76%. That's Democrats. Completely reversed, Republicans, right thing, 71%. Stayed out, 25%. So people are seeing this in 2006, that question as a question, almost like a trick question. What, did George Bush go to war, war for oil? Did they lie about WMD? Respondents are seeing this as a partisan question, and they're giving a partisan answer. But you contrast this. We've had other divisive wars, much more divisive than Iraq, actually. Was Vietnam a mistake? Now, this question's asked during the Vietnam and Korean War. I'll give you Korean War, too. Democrat, not a mistake, 37%. Republican, not a mistake, 34%. Mm-hmm. Mistake, Democrat, 51%. Republican, 56%. Korean War, almost identical numbers. So Americans see war, have always seen war through whatever lens they're looking. They're pacifists, they're hawks, whatever. It wasn't a partisan issue. And you can see why it's not healthy for it to be a partisan issue, because you don't want it to be George Bush's war or Donald Trump's war or, Barack Obama's war. You want it to be the United States going to war. And in Afghanistan, Americans had traditional views. They had a view, but it wasn't partisan. And this is probably because I'm looking at John's data here, because this is a war started by Bush, continued by Barack Obama, uncertainly, continued even less certainly by Donald Trump, and then wrapped up by Joe Biden. So a Republican and a Democrat prosecuted the war. A Republican and a Democrat came to the decision to end the war. You had 4 presidencies, and partisanship didn't figure in, and Americans responded. That's how, if we should get out of Afghanistan, that polled well right up until now. Now, if a Republican would say, well, what we're really responding to is the botched exit from Afghanistan. We didn't know, Joe Biden would do it so badly. Oh, I'll grant there's some of that. But what really is happening here, I think, if you look at John's data, is Republicans are changing their mind because of who the person in the White House is. And this is exactly what Democrats do as well. That, to me, it's a warning sign. It's something, if I put on my good government hat for a minute, I think both parties should be conscious of and counsel against and be careful how they speak. So that was the one thing I got. One of the things I got from this numbers is a continuation of this trend where we see war as, through a party lens, not healthy for a democracy. The other thing I wanted to highlight, and then I'll throw it back to John, because he's actually the expert on young voters. He's got a book coming out on young voters. I should do a webinar on that book. But again, in this poll, like our other surveys this year and last year, voters under 40, voters under 30 have markedly different attitudes on some of these questions. And on national security, it's important because, they'll inherit public policy soon. You have all these millennials in Congress and Gen Zers coming. On all these issues, there is, on some of these important issues, there's critical difference. I use that word, critical race theory. Young people think, yeah, teach that at the military academies. Sure, why not? Not older voters, not so much. And the same with China, the same with, how do you, Taiwan, Korea. There are differences in young voters. They are, to paint with a broad brush, more progressive, less hawkish, less wed to traditional ideas of how to use the military than older voters. So those are the two things that struck me. Is there anything else, John, that well, I'll just throw it back to you or to Andy or John.
Well, John, we've got a couple of questions in, so I'm trying to respond to some of them. This was an interesting one. I thought they said you were in the field. They must have looked at the research tab. September 16th to the 20th was when the study was being done. So that was after the Afghan pullout, and it was that Friday was the day that the Pentagon admitted that the drone strike had killed 10 civilians. So that news hit right in the middle of when the questions were being asked. The question is, do you think that affected the way, especially the low numbers for the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staffs in terms of confidence on that previous slide that we were looking at?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Overall, we didn't see these numbers overly kind of affected by that news. I mean, most polling that I've seen, top line numbers paint a similar story around overall opinions regarding kind of Afghanistan, right? I think that one of the reasons that those numbers were low is because for Milley and for Austin is because obviously the kind of the hyper kind of partisan opinions over the last several weeks, specifically around General Milley in the controversy around teaching CRT in the military academies. But also there's a significant number of Americans who just aren't comfortable offering up strong opinions, right? Who chose don't know for those individuals. So whereas the overall trust numbers are lower, there's a much higher number of folks who are undecided. But no question, they are part of the significant kind of partisan divide that Carl mentioned earlier, as Democrats in Congress are, Republicans in Congress, and President Biden as well.
Carl, there's a question here. I think this might be directed more towards you because of your article when you said that they view China as a problem, but they also see domestic divisions as a bigger problem. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Now I'll ask John to follow up, but yes. So ask an open-ended question, not an open-ended question. Two choices: domestic or foreign. Which do you see as a bigger problem? A majority, I think it was 58%, right, John? 58% said domestic. The rest said foreign. Now, I'll point out something. That's something of a Democratic Party talking point these days. And you had this riot at the Capitol on January 6th, and people, there's still inquiries going into it. People are being prosecuted. Former President Trump is still out there saying the election was stolen from him, which makes people think we could have another January 6th. So this is what we call, a developing story in the news business. And it's not an entirely academic question because it plays into partisan politics. Still, I was struck by that. And I wrote about it. And, this is an old theme. Abraham Lincoln, when he was 28 years old, warned, and he was talking about mob violence by pro-slavery mobs who killed a publisher and burnt his building and threw his printing press into the river. That's what he was talking about specifically. But he said, no foreign army, the Tsar of Russia, Napoleon, nobody could come. They couldn't take a drink out of the Ohio River if we didn't let them, but the threat could come from within. That's a strain in American history that still exists, and people are very conscious of it. More so, I think, after the January 6th events at the Capitol than in recent years. But it's a pronounced part of our history, and Americans are very conscious about it.
Yeah, I think I would, as Carl said, 58% chose domestic over foreign policy. And it's essentially every single demographic group, right? So actually, baby boomers and older voters are actually more likely than even younger voters to say that domestic threats are of greater concern. I would also, though, when we have conversations, whether it's in the open ends of this survey or in focus groups in other conversations that we have, Carl, I think that folks think they widen the aperture rather than just the insurrection. This has been a number that I've seen over many years, 5 or 6 years. So I don't think this is necessarily new. I think the insurrection in the specifics around domestic political terrorism is heightened, obviously concerns, but this, I think, kind of speaks to the overall, lack of bipartisanship, collegiality, in Washington generally, and some of the, systemic economic and other concerns that folks have around the domestic agenda broadly.
Let me add one more point to that, if I may. It's not only right-wing violence that we're talking about either. You have Antifa, turning Portland into a war zone. There was violence around some of the Black Lives Matter movements. There was, policemen were attacked. So that's a more encompassing thing than just, you're right. Not just January 6th, but even more than the right. It's some of it's on the left, some of it's from immigrants. People can answer that question, have other things in their minds. But the point is that we're talking about national defense, and a majority of Americans see threats within our own borders. They're more worried about that than threats from foreign borders. And that's pretty bracing news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So 2 questions. One is on young people and Afghanistan in particular, and whether you have any further insights into that, what their objections were. And the second is about the draft, because we did ask a question about the draft. So either one, John, why don't you go first on young people?
I'll touch first on young people, then I'd love to hit Carl's kind of perspective on the all-volunteer force. Yeah, younger people in every poll that I have tracked, including in this one, have been less supportive of withdrawal than older Americans. Okay, which seems somewhat counterintuitive. However, similar to the comment I made about Generals Milley and Secretary Austin, there is a much higher level of undecided or don't know to have a firm opinion. Okay, so that's what we're finding among younger people. And what's so important, I think, in these conversations and over the last couple of years during the presidential campaign, this is the time that younger people are determining their values. This is the time when this is the lens of which younger people are seeing kind of global events, and then will determine what they think is right or wrong about foreign policy. So right now we have a plurality of Gen Z, close to, I think, a majority of millennials support withdrawing the troops, not as high as their parents and grandparents, and a much higher number of people say, I just don't know enough at this point to have a strong opinion. I think the don't know on that one is a fifth or so of those generations.
Carl, what about the draft?
Yeah, I'll add two things about the draft. First is that young people were much the most opposed to the draft in the survey. That's understandable because they'd be drafted, and that's probably, you could probably go back to Vietnam, Andy, when you and I were kids, and that was probably true then. Young people are opposed to the draft, but not as opposed as staying in Afghanistan. Now that gets to this. That relates to this other point. It's easy to commit troops when you don't have to go, and we have this all volunteer force. 1% of us, serve, and there's a well-known historian, Andrew Bacevich, professor, who after 9/11, he's an Army veteran. He lost his son who volunteered for the Army and lost his life in combat. And Andrew Bacevich, Professor Bacevich, has written about this, and he talks about, he's worried that the all-volunteer military has an unforeseen consequence, and has for years, and that we were very slow to recognize it, and that most Americans don't recognize it today. Namely, it makes it too easy for commanders in chief to commit troops to combat, because you don't have what you had in Vietnam, which is, riots and demonstrations and chanting, hell no, we won't go, because they don't have to go, the college students, the intellectuals. Who goes are these people, disproportionately working class, who volunteer for our service. And his idea is that if you brought in a draft, you'd have fewer of these wars. Now, John John and his team asked a question about that, to specifically read 2 statements about the draft, very neutral, very worded beautifully. And it's, pointing out what I just said about people who think that. And you didn't get a majority in favor of the draft, but it changed it about 5 points for both. And I thought that was significant. John and we haven't had a chance to talk about this. John may not think it's significant as I do, but the reason I think it's significant is that this is not a national conversation we're having. John McCain and Charlie Rangel used to talk openly about compulsory national service, which included either the military or the Peace Corps or something like it. No prominent American politician is discussing this now. And I think that if this was part of the discussion, if we were talking about this more openly, if presidents and presidential candidates were talking about it, in other words, if the electorate was educated to some of the other sides of this issue of the all volunteer force, I think the numbers might change. But it's a counterfactual, because I'm presupposing a national conversation isn't taking place. But we changed that number by 5 points by simply reading one paragraph to these people. And I thought that was significant.
And Carl, if I can mention, whenever we just zero in on the most vulnerable, okay, the folks who would be drafted, 18 to 24-year-olds, okay, there is significant differences based upon race, okay? Whereas white Americans still oppose it, okay? Young African Americans are much more likely to kind of support it when they hear the fuller language, that you mentioned from Professor kind of Basovich, right? And we also see some different movement between those without a college education, those with a college education. So, again, these are issues that have not been a significant part of our dialogue, are far more nuanced than we think. And I think that's the real value that we try to bring, with surveys like this, not just talking about those top line numbers like support opposed Afghanistan, but to talk about these like interesting generational differences based on race, education, partisanship, et cetera.
So one other question came in, or a couple other questions came in. We'll try to get to maybe one or two more, and then we're going to wrap it up. But they view China as a problem. They see attack on Taiwan as well. The question is, I guess, do they see the attack on Taiwan as a near-term threat? Was that in response to a question that we posed, or is that a threat that the participants identified themselves?
That was not identified as an open end. We offered up a variety of different scenarios to ask whether or not they support or oppose to these potential missions, and one of which was defending Taiwan. On that, as I said, 3 out of 5 of all Americans support that mission. Big gap, though, between for big gap in intervention in Asia more broadly, again based upon generation. Okay, so older Americans, those who or part of or remember Korea, Vietnam, et cetera, are much more likely to support, strong power intervention in just to defend both South Korea as well as Taiwan.
And then, do they see a difference between deploying troops in places like Germany, Korea, Japan, I guess places where we've traditionally deployed troops, and new deployments in other countries? I think this was part of the thinking about Afghanistan, was that to leave behind a small residual number of troops. At least we know what the generals thought of that at this point. Some of them thought it was a pretty good idea, and I'm wondering whether the participants had any views on that in terms of like that sort of long-term peacekeeping, I guess, deterrent role that the military plays.
I want Carl. My first take is that I think overall Americans are very supportive of a robust and rigorous military to support, basically to prevent war, right? And that's what soft power missions are designed to do. Like those are the missions that receive the greatest level of support across every demographic group. 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5 support those missions. I would argue kind of wherever they are in the world, right? Whether it's responding at common situations around natural disasters, humanitarian support, et cetera, et cetera. So that is part of these missions kind of around the world. I think it gets complicated when you add the politics and the extent of a 20-year effort in Afghanistan, then we have a different set of facts that people are kind of responding to. But in theory, there is broad agreement about the role of the U.S. military in that respect.
Carl, last words, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll add one thing to I agree with what John said. We didn't ask the question precisely that way that the questioner did. It would have been a good question. Maybe we'll do it in a subsequent poll. But you have this poll, 82% of Americans support the military to protect human rights. And, we've got that poll. That's the top number. But that's what the mission in Afghanistan eventually came down to, was supporting human rights. And the Americans are not in favor of that. So you ask Americans theoretical questions, they give you a pretty good heartfelt answer. But sometimes when it comes down to it, and there's cost, and the costs in Afghanistan were high, Americans grow weary of the commitment. So there's this dichotomy between, war is hell. People have said over the years. Sherman said it, Napoleon said it, and Americans understand that. And so even though they want heaven on earth, they know war is hell, and they get tired of it.
Well, that's a good place to leave it. We'll wrap it up there. As I said at the beginning, you can read Carl's article on the poll, as well as see the top line results, other analysis. It's all at RealClearPolitics.com. You just click on the tab at the top of the page. It's labeled Opinion Research. You can find out more about past polls we've done as well. So I want to thank Carl Cannon, John Della Volpe. We also have a podcast that runs Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. You can find that on the site. It's on Apple and other podcast platforms as well. And tomorrow on that podcast, tomorrow Friday, we'll have John Della Volpe on, and we'll talk about a bit more about this poll. We'll talk about the events this week. Been a pretty busy week in Washington, as you all know. And we'll also talk about John's new book. It's called Fight: How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. It's a provocative title. I'm looking forward to talking about it. So it'll be an interesting show. I hope you'll join us. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks to Aaron Waters, Liz Martin for organizing today's conference. Feel free to reach out to them if you want to know more about RealClear Opinion Research. Thanks to John Sorensen, who produced today's event, and thank you for joining us. Of course, until next time, for RealClear Politics and for RealClear Opinion Research, I'm Andrew Walworth.